I find ourselves in an interesting position here today. And as Mr. Barrett has expanded on in the last number of minutes, we are first, and I believe that this bears highlighting, at a meeting a number of weeks ago, the NDP actually had requested some documents be provided, and those documents had a timeline on it. And there is a requirement for the committee to deal with those documents. And that timeline has passed, and this committee has not yet had an opportunity to deal with that, although both the meeting today and the meeting this past Tuesday did have this committee business as was listed publicly in camera. So I am very curious about why we are in the situation we're in when we hear often from Liberals and the New Democrats that would say that somehow it is Conservatives that are to blame for everything that is held up in committee and Parliament, and we hear this at length, especially in the House. But, Mr. Chair, what I would highlight before I get into the substance of my remarks is that because of Liberal actions backed up by the NDP, this committee has not had a chance to deal with some of the important business that sits before it, whether that be some information that was related to a request that was made at the end of a committee meeting. It's about 3 weeks ago now, if memory serves correctly. And the deadline was at 2 weeks, so obviously that has passed. And because the committee has not had a chance to substantively sit in camera and deal with the business at hand, we still don't have a resolution to that. And then, of course, we have what is talked about in the public declaration, that there was a consideration of a draft report that I'll name the federal government's use of technological tools capable of extracting personal data from mobile devices and computers. Part of what the important work the committee does has to do with these reports. We do studies, we move motions that do studies, we call witnesses, and then the committee has a chance, or should have a chance, to go through those reports and edit them. The fine work that our analysts and staff do to help compile these reports, the committee goes through it, and then that's what often there's disagreement, discussion, very frank conversations, and I actually share with constituents often about how there is people often think that the only thing that happens in Parliament is question period. But there's often frank discussions that do take place, and sometimes those are in camera. But what in the reports that committees put together is what was planned to be dealt with today, as was mentioned in the notice of meeting. Yet here we are, debating a motion that I'll get into here in a second, but it's troubling that while the Liberals are quick to complain about anything that doesn't go their way, they forget about who ultimately we are here to serve. So what I'd like to do, Chair, and what I'll attempt to do and share with the committee and those who are watching, is to highlight how the actions and the place that we have come to today truly is an attempt by the Liberals, with the support of the NDP, to silence critics. That's what it comes down to. An attempt by the government, ultimately, to silence anyone who would dare ask them tough questions. And, Mr. Speaker, or Mr. Chair, what I would further suggest is that they are attempting to weaponize tools and protections that are meant to ensure that all MPs, not just members of the opposition, I think that's, and I'll get into more detail on the specifics of what that looks like in our Westminster democratic system here if I have the opportunity. But there are specific tools that are granted to members of Parliament that protect us so that we can ask tough questions. And I would note, specifically when it comes to the topic at hand, which is foreign election interference, there is this thing called privilege. And for those watching, they may not be aware of the nuances and the history of what parliamentary privilege is. And there's a long history dating back centuries to what we refer to as the Mother Parliament, the Palace of Westminster in the United Kingdom, that ensures that parliamentarians, those who are elected to the House of Commons, have protection. And I'm going to read some quotes into the record that specifically speak to why that is significant. But ultimately, the Coles Notes version of what is an extensive conversation about why we got to this point is because there had to be an understanding that parliamentarians had to be able to have those tough conversations. And at the time when some of these were called into question and lives were literally on the line. You know, you look back at some of the big battles that took place in parliamentary history. There were lives on the line about whether or not the king could take the life of a parliamentarian because of a parliamentarian's being opposed to something a king was doing. These are questions that had life or death consequences. So they were hard fought to the point where today it allows MPs, opposition and government, to ask tough questions without fear of reprisal. Now, what it does not do, what it clearly does not do, was not designed to do, should not do, and I would suggest cannot do, is silence critics from being able to ask tough questions. All of us around this table and so many, and all 338 members of Parliament that have the honor of occupying, being a temporary tenant in a seat in the House of Commons, because we don't own those seats. No, they're owned by the people. We need to take seriously that need to represent them. And yet what we have before us is an attempt specifically to silence Mr. Brock, who is very effective. There is no question. I don't think anybody from any party would suggest that Mr. Brock is anything but effective when it comes to prosecuting important issues, whether that be in his previous career as a Crown prosecutor or whether that be here in Parliament. And he does ask tough questions. For anyone who has ever heard or listened to him, he asks tough questions, and quite frankly, I'm glad he does. Because that is the point of why privilege exists. And to ensure, and in fact, it's page 57 of the third edition of the House of Commons Procedure and Practice describes parliamentary privilege as the following. And this emphasizes the point that I have just attempted to make. The rights and immunities that are deemed necessary for the House of Commons as an institution and its members as representatives of the electorate to fulfill their functions. Mr. Chair, that's key. So what we have here is an attempt by a member of the government that was undoubtedly a subject that had come up in the course of discussion. In fact, it was my friend from the Bloc Québécois who at one point brought forward a concern to this committee, saying that whether or not it was an actual conflict, it certainly appeared to be a conflict of interest, that the member from Steveston Richmond East was sitting at the table. That wasn't Conservatives that brought that forward. I didn't hear the Liberals demand an apology from the Bloc Québécois for suggesting that there might be an appearance of a conflict of interest. And there certainly would have been, and I have no doubt, Mr. Chair, that if that member wanted to be a witness at committee to talk about some of those things, I'm quite confident that there would have been allowance for him to be able to do that. But is that what the focus is? No. The focus of this motion is to try and silence the member from Brantford Brant for being effective at asking tough questions. Did those questions offend somebody? Maybe. Did those questions call into question a member's conduct? Maybe. But what I think we need to remember, Mr. Chair, is that we have to be allowed to ask those tough questions. So one thing that I believe bears mentioning, Mr. Chair, is that over the course of my close to 4.5 years that I've had the honour of serving as a member of Parliament in the constituency of Battle River Crowfoot, beautiful area of East Central Alberta, is I've had been able to ask some of those tough questions, been able to do my best to represent the people that sent me here, understanding full well that that doesn't make everybody happy. And I've faced some criticisms at different points in time, as I would suggest we all have if we're honest about the role that we play. And as a member of the opposition, one of the fundamental roles of that, and in fact it was Conservative leader Pierre Poilievre, when asked by President Biden about what it was to be the leader of His Majesty's loyal opposition. It was an interesting conversation. It was picked up on camera. And Mr. Poilievre made mention of the fact that in Canada, the act of opposition is an act of loyalty. And I think that's very, very profound. That just because we disagree doesn't mean that we aren't passionate about the future of our country. Just because we have disagreements or different policy ideas or whatever the case is, you can really fill in the blank. But what has been a troubling trend that we've seen under these Liberals, so with the support of the NDP, it seems at any cost, which is a troubling metric in and of itself, especially because that's not what Canadians voted for, but is that the Liberals do not want an opposition. They make that clear on a regular basis. Instead, Mr. Chair, they seem to only want an audience. And what's so disconcerting about that is that the very fundamental basis of the institution in which we are all a part of, the House of Commons, was built upon that idea that you could have opposition, whether that be 8+ centuries ago when it was the people wanting to call account of the crown, and instead of fighting a battle which would have seen death and destruction, they came to a point where they could have arguments. Whether that be the many instances where throughout the history of our Parliament where we have been able to have disagreements, and then there are, Chair, times where we do come together. And my colleague, Mr. Barrett, talked about how when it comes to a bill, C-70, that has been introduced to address, in fact, substantively, is something that does address aspects of foreign election interference. So it's a fitting and very relevant to the topic at hand here. Conservatives were quick to make suggestion that there was the ability for us to come together and figure out a way to ensure that that was passed, so that prior to the next election, our intelligence apparatus in this country would be prepared to ensure that the integrity of our electoral framework was in fact protected. So I know, and I'm sure those watching will often think that see that there's those highlighted examples where MPs oppose each other, and that's fair. And I know certainly my constituents have made it very clear to me that I am to oppose the Liberal agenda, oppose it, and do so loudly. In fact, I hear that on a regular basis. But there are those instances where we do work together. So it's not to suggest that that doesn't happen. But what is so important is for that freedom to take place, which leads me into some of the conversation around the idea of privilege. We have before us a motion that suggests that there was a violation of a member's privilege. And I'll get into some of the substance of the motion here in a moment, but I would just a note for Mr. Baines, and maybe he would like to address the reason why there's actually a factual error, I believe, Mr. Chair, in the motion, and it's suggesting that the conversation took place on a day that I don't believe there was actually a meeting. May 23rd. I believe that the committee was previously occupied during that day. I may stand to be corrected on that. I would certainly appreciate if Mr. Baines had the opportunity when he is able to take the floor to address the specifics of that day. But what Mr. Baines is suggesting is that asking tough questions is somehow a violation of his privilege as an MP. I had mentioned page 57 of the third edition of House of Commons Procedure and Practice and its descriptor of parliamentary privilege. And I would like to further, in that third edition, read from page 88 that says members individually have the responsibility not to abuse their rights and immunities, particularly freedoms of speech. And what I would suggest is being highlighted in the debate we're having here is the fact that we have the responsibility as members of Parliament to not abuse the privileges, but also we cannot abuse the ability and the idea of privilege to be able to weaponize that sort of thing for the purposes of silencing one's critics. And it leads me to the inevitable conclusion that, as I mentioned before, that it is not about whether or not that members' rights and privileges were violated, but I would suggest that that member was facing pressure because of the conversation that took place. And quite frankly, Mr. Chair, I would say that is a good thing. That's what democracy is supposed to be about. It is meant to be a space where we can have and ask and have those tough conversations. But here we are where there is an attempt through a procedural mechanism, and for those who might be watching that are wondering what a procedural mechanism is, it's using the rules that exist for us to be able to fulfill our functions, using it for something that it was not intended to be used for, in order to, in this case, the member from Brantford-Brant, who is a very effective prosecutor in terms of calling out some of the things that the government has done wrong. Using those mechanisms, not for their purpose of the ability for committees to function properly, not for the purposes of protecting members' freedoms of speech, but rather to narrowly interpret privilege as something to silence an opponent. Now, if you could just imagine for a moment, Mr. Chair, what it would be like if during an election you had a national party leader tell one of his opponents that they can or cannot talk about something. It'd be a national scandal. It would be truly a national scandal. We have free, fair, and open discourse because that's what Canadians expect us to be able to have. And that is something that needs to be extended to committee. Now, there have been some accusations made about intent. And there have been further suggestions that somehow that it is incorrect for members to call out these certain things. And I've faced the consequences personally of calling out things that I have deemed to be absolutely egregious, including conduct of the Prime Minister. And I respected, in that case, the Speaker's ruling on that matter. While I disagreed and stand behind what I said, I understood the consequences of that. But, Chair, where we have come today is that are we going to set a precedent that suggests that instead of being able to have these tough conversations, that we are going to allow for procedural mechanisms to be able to take away the ability, rather, for any member of this place to be able to do their work. And I want to highlight something here that I think is often forgotten. We have the principle, and something that is unique to the Westminster system, actually. And part of the reason why, for those who I've had the opportunity to engage with on the matter, is part of the reason why I like the Westminster system of Parliament so much, is the idea of parliamentary supremacy. And it's key because it ultimately ensures that people have the ultimate say. And although there's an extensive conversation that could be had about that, I want to park that larger conversation because it can get fairly philosophical, and there's differences of opinions rather about when and where and how some of the mechanisms that exist have been brought to bear, both in the context of the Canadian circumstances, where we have both written and unwritten aspects of our Constitution, versus the United Kingdom, where it is still largely unwritten in terms of the constitutional frameworks that exist. And I've talked a little bit about that here and at other committees in the past. But what is key is that it is members of Parliament that make up a Parliament. So for individuals who might be watching, Mr. Chair, I believe it's worth highlighting something that is often forgotten. We are in the 44th Parliament. Now, one might ask, well, what is a Parliament? Well, we often refer to that as a building. In the case of the House of Commons, the chamber with its green floors and the question period and the debates and whatnot. But what's interesting, Chair, is that a Parliament is actually the description of it is the place where a group of MPs are able to come together, which form that Parliament. And then out of that, in the case of our tradition, this is tradition, and has become constitutional convention, the party that gets the most seats is able to form the government, of which the government is the cabinet led by the Prime Minister, which, interestingly, the history of that is that the Prime Minister was the first minister up among ministers that refer to in the Latin history of the word, the first among equals, although that's certainly been something that's been long since abandoned. But what's interesting, Chair, and this bears, I think, an important point to be made, is that is not simply applicable to members of the opposition. When I describe our democratic system to classes, whether it's junior high, high school, or even some elementary classes, I talk about every person being allowed to have that one, every Canadian being allowed to have that one ballot on Election Day. That is an incredible thing. That right we have is an incredible privilege, hard fought for and won over history. And the fact that the current Prime Minister or the leader of a political party, any political party, they get the same number of ballots on Election Day. It's incredible. The power to choose your government, every Canadian getting that one ballot. And I asked the question about how many ballots you get on Election Day. It's interesting, some of the conversations that ensue in classrooms about that, because it is that distribution of authority to the people that truly is fundamental in the way that our democratic system operates. Now, although I would be the first to admit that that's not always equitable in terms of the number of individuals per electoral district, and there's some always nuances in the conversation, but fundamentally it comes down to every Canadian gets that one ballot on Election Day. Powerful thing. And I know for you, Chair, this would be the same thing. You and I and all members of this committee, including staff and technical folks, they get to have that one ballot to make a choice about who gets to represent them in the House of Commons. But here's the extension of that and why parliamentary supremacy is so key. That one ballot translates into, in the case of our current Parliament, 338 seats. Now, another question I ask students when I have the chance to speak with them is that how many seats does the Prime Minister occupy in the House of Commons? And again, it's interesting, some of the responses that I get. But it comes down to one. I ask the same of the Leader of the Opposition. They occupy one seat in the House of Commons. And in the case of our current Parliament, there are 338 members of Parliament that sit and make decisions and empower the government to be able to act on their behalf. Now, the opposition plays a key role in that against the government and the governing party versus in the case of a minority parliament, or a hung parliament, as it's often referred to in the United Kingdom. But ultimately, it comes down to the fact that there are members of Parliament, 338 of them. And while we do have whips and there are conventions when it comes to voting and in voting for confidence measures, and in the case of opposition, we voted non-confidence in the government on a very regular basis, every MP occupies that one seat in the House of Commons. And the power of that, I would suggest, emphasizes the idea of the foundational idea of what privilege is in this place and in the specific context around this table. So I'd like to emphasize how fundamental it is that they're not, and that any attempt to silence members of Parliament from being able to ask the tough questions, to silence members of Parliament from being able to represent their constituents, is not simply an attack on the idea of privilege in this place, but rather is an attack on the fundamental tenets of